As we continue our conversation about discrimination in the workplace, we can turn now to anti-discrimination regulations. When we think about anti-discrimination regulations, we really are talking about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act was begun under the Kennedy administration, but was passed in the Johnson administration with heavy support and activity influence from President Johnson himself. Recall that President Johnson had this vision of a great society, including a society in which discrimination of all types, racial, gender, etc., were eroded or eliminated. This is really carrying on some of the legacy of the Kennedy administration, but it was also something dear to the heart of Lyndon Baines Johnson. We also have to think about a series of executive orders that were instituted by various presidents from Johnson, or rather from Kennedy all the way through Bill Clinton and even into the Bush era. We'll be thinking about and talking a little bit about the EEOC, or the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission, and a concept or a doctrine referred to as affirmative action, and then also a little bit about reverse discrimination. So as we consider some of the different anti-discrimination regulations themselves, we're running through regulations from the Equal Pay Act of 1963 all the way through the Genetic Information Act of 2008. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 simply stated that workers with similar jobs should be paid the same regardless of their observable characteristics. A male, a female, black, white, pregnant, non-pregnant, disabled, not disabled, regardless of their observable characteristics, they should be paid the same amount. That right, or that act, kind of paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 clearly deals with issues reaching far beyond labor market discrimination. It deals with civil rights generally in the country and was motivated by the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and early 1960s. It remains one of the landmark pieces of legislation that many see right up alongside of the Bill of Rights as establishing rights for U.S. citizens. We continue on with Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967. That made it such that an employer could not discriminate against a worker because of their age. The Vietnam Era Vets Readjustment Act of 1974, which was really rather interesting all by itself. Previous to the Vietnam War, when veterans would return from war, they were largely lauded as heroes. In the Korean conflict, that began to erode a little bit, but that conflict wasn't as far-reaching in the lives of American households as World War I, World War II, or even as the Vietnam conflict. Now, certainly it had tremendous influence on the lives and households of those that served in Korea. But in terms of the breadth of the American households, it wasn't as far-reaching as those other conflicts. But the Vietnam conflict was one that started out somewhat quietly, if you will. It was a conflict. It was supported by President Eisenhower, President Kennedy. Its veterans were not overtly popular, but they weren't disdained either. They then became rather popular, as any young men or women returning from war would be, but then quickly, as the war became unpopular, the plight of the Vietnam-era veterans became difficult. In fact, even desperate towards the end. The war had become so unpopular, and some of the activities of war had become so apparent within the media. The Vietnam conflict was the first conflict, the first war in which the media was present virtually all the time, and the atrocities of war executed by both sides were evident to the American household, and war became amazingly unpopular and has remained such ever since, which is probably a good thing, by the way. But the Vietnam Era Readjustment Act made it such that one couldn't discriminate in the labor market or in other markets against Vietnam veterans, which tells us that there was a discriminatory attitude at that time against those veterans, which is unfortunate. These are men and women that went and would risk their lives in defense of their country or believing that it was in defense of their country. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 made it such that one worker, employee, customer, firm could not discriminate against pregnant individuals. This would fall generally under not being able to discriminate someone because of health attributes, as long as those health attributes did not affect the productivity of the individual. Arguably, pregnancy will ultimately have some effect on the productivity of the individual, at least in the days surrounding when birth is given. But this act made it such that one could not discriminate based upon that. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 really opened that doctrine up broadly. There was a revision of the Civil Rights Act in 1991, which really just updated the 1964 Act, and because we had seen different forms of discrimination creep in, including harassment and such that had not been expressly handled under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64. And then the more recent of the acts that we're dealing with here is the Genetic Information Act of 2008. I've not heard of a case in which genetic information has expressly provided some discrimination in the labor market. But as our genetic information becomes more widely available through electronic health records, through DNA sequencing, through records kept by local and state authorities, it becomes more and more likely, or possible at least, that some of this information could lead to forms of discrimination. And so the Genetic Information Act of 2008 was put in place. Each one of these acts have something in common. Excuse me. They make it unlawful to make employment decisions, wage decisions, promotion decisions for someone based upon observable characteristics that have nothing to do with the productivity of the individual. As we go a little bit further, we have to think about a series of executive orders and what those executive orders accomplished. We'll start with John Kennedy. However, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president prior to President Kennedy, also issued an executive order that laid the groundwork for some of the orders that were then issued by other presidents. And recall that an executive order is simply a unilateral order issued under the power and authority of the office of the president that is not ratified by or voted on by the houses of Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives or the Senate, and it's not sustained or ratified by a vote from the population as well. But it is a reaching out based upon the authority of the president. Well, President Kennedy, in an executive order 10-925 in 1961, established the doctrine of affirmative action, which went on to be a major element within discrimination or anti-discrimination regulations in the United States. The doctrine of affirmative action sets the stage for attempting to treat classes of individuals differently in order to, quote, right the wrongs of prior generations. And in this case, this was specifically focused on trying to bring the treatment and employment and compensation of black Americans up to par with that of white Americans. President Johnson, in his Great Society efforts in Executive Order 11-246, required that government contractors take affirmative action and evidence that they're attacking it in their employment decisions. President Nixon, often lauded for being extraordinarily conservative, obviously a very unpopular president towards the end of his presidency and in the years following because of his pending impeachment and then resignation over the Watergate affairs, if you will, directs federal agencies to develop comprehensive plans and establish a minority business enterprise contracting program. an MBE is simply a type of affirmative action seeking to give some preference to minority businesses, but in this case, minority is not expressly black Americans. In this case, minority is any underserved or underrepresented class, female, Hispanic, Asian, black, anything other than the white male-dominated business. As we move forward, President Carter, Jimmy Carter, in 1979, issued Executive Order 12-138. It created the National Women's Business Enterprise Policy, which really was just an outreach of the MBE created by the prior president. And President Reagan, who also is considered really rather conservative, was not necessarily recognized as a friend to minorities. His executive order extended this minority business enterprise development plan. This simply became seen as just good business because it eliminated the utility maximizing decisions that were often executed when it came to government contracts and caused these to become more profit maximizing decisions, which as economists we appreciate that because it simply means greater efficiency. And then President Clinton, through an executive order in July 1995, famously stated, "Mend it, don't end it." And this is with respect to affirmative action. He was reaffirming affirmative action as it had become rather unpopular. Well, affirmative action became unpopular because it also became synonymous with reverse discrimination. We found that through MBE's affirmative action that traditionally popular, long-standing contracts that had been held for white business owners or white employees, especially white males, now became less able to be executed, less likely to be hired, not because of their lack of productivity, not because of their lack of efficiency, but because there was preference being given to minority candidates and minority contract offerees, such that there was some reverse discrimination. This became canonized in the domestic lexicon with the Bakke decision in California. The Regents of the University of California v. Bakke is a famous case, nearly as famous as Roe v. Wade, and Bakke had applied to the University of California med school. He had applied twice. He was qualified. He had been turned down each time, and he held that he was being discriminated against because he was not black or not Hispanic, because he was white. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And under the premise that his civil rights had been violated under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Supreme Court found, in fact, that they had, and ordered a change in these admission requirements, and indicated or stated that race could not be considered in these admission requirements. It kind of changed the landscape, or the trajectory of the landscape of college admissions and employment decisions under the growing support of affirmative action at that time, and really was an inflection point such that affirmative action began to take a back seat and over the following decades became increasingly unpopular. It's important to recall that all of these regulations only had to come about because different classes of individuals within our society were discriminated against, not given proper compensation, not given proper opportunities, not because they weren't good workers or they wouldn't have become good workers, not because they were less productive than others, but because of observable characteristics. It's an unfortunate indictment on a population and a polity when this is the case, and unfortunately, it simply serves to focus on the fact that as individuals, we sometimes make irrational decisions, but irrational with respect to the benefit for all, not necessarily irrational in construct or in context of our REM, rationally evaluating manipulative maximizer structures, but irrational in terms of whether they are in the best interest of all. We always tend to serve our own self-interests, even when those self-interests are not all that beneficial for the interests of society as a whole. It speaks to the ignorance that has been bred through generations within different parts of our country especially, but ignorance that exists within, in some measure, within most of us. And so it's an unfortunate indictment on the population when fair treatment of individuals, reasonable treatment of individuals, efficient treatment of individuals has to be legislated.